today's conversation, I titled Finding Superpowers because I feel like that is the psychic ability of our guest, Amy Edgar. Amy is a trained nurse practitioner. She is a mom with kids who have been on a decades long journey for special diagnoses, circumstances. And it all drove Amy's pursuit of her education and her career in nursing and functioning as a nurse practitioner. And it led to the creation a few years ago, actually a really long time ago now, Amy, we're old, but several years ago, of the Children's Integrated Center for Success, which is found online at everychildeverytime.com. And Amy's entire vision and approach to diagnosing a child with behavioral needs is really unique. It functions at, I always say, the uncomfortable fringes of diagnostic medicine and care delivery because she's looking for the unspoken conversations and helping connect them to the kids that she's treating and caring. I worked with Amy prior to ever becoming a mom. As you guys know, my background was in clinical care delivery and healthcare systems and models, changing before working with adoption share. And then I adopted two tweens. And Amy was invaluable, and her entire practice helped uncover some incredible things that not only did I not have on my radar, but like wasn't even remotely in the conversation of any of the experts that we were turning to. So as we go on, I may jump in and share some of those insights with you guys as they are appropriate. But Amy, I am doing an injustice to the incredible wealth of knowledge walking around in your human body. But I, the thing that always gets me is that Amy works with these families and helps kids identify their superpowers rather than the thing that's wrong with them. And I feel like the single biggest spot that the thing that's wrong with them conversation happens is in foster care and adoption. And so I'm thrilled to have you here because I truly feel like this is the grassroots ground level base of that conversation and exactly how you're changing the DNA of care delivery. So I'll shut up, turn it over to you, and then I'm happy to jump in for Q&A later. As you guys come up with questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll jot them down and make sure that we return to them once we turn things over to the broader Q&A. For now, though, if you can mute your lines, that would be great. Amy, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Whitney. I will do my best to live up to an iota of what you just described. I have to say that one of the most rewarding experiences I've had as a clinician was being able to work with you and your family through the adoption process. And I have great respect and admiration for everyone on this call who is committed to helping children in whatever way that manifests. So we all know there are lots of children out in the world who need us, and you guys are the team. You represent the team that shows up. So thank you on behalf of all that you do for children. I have advanced the slide to the hello slide. As Whitney said, I'm a nurse practitioner. I have two certifications as a provider, one in primary care. So I think about the health, the general health of children. And I have another credential in psychiatry. So I think about the health of children from a physical health perspective, from an emotional health perspective, a behavioral health perspective. I really look at the whole child. And for me as a mom, that was something that I found missing in my attempts to get help for my family. So my daughter is, I have two daughters. My oldest daughter is 21 and a senior in college. My youngest daughter is 18 and is finishing out her senior year in high school, and she also has autism. So the work that I do is really informed by the life I've lived with my family, and represents all the things that we wanted and we're having a hard time finding out in the world of treatment. So as Whitney mentioned, I started a practice in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Yes, it was 5 years ago. I can't believe it. We hit the 5-year mark. We've seen about 4,000 families, almost at 4,500 families to date. And families come to us with a variety of different concerns, and most of them are really they fall into kind of three categories. So the first is my child isn't doing well at school. The second is there's something going on with my child and I just can't figure out what it is. And the third is my child's behavior is driving us all crazy and we can't take it. And so there's those are kind of the general three things that people come to us asking for help with, and then what we do is go looking for the child's. I We reference it as their superpowers. So our model is very different in that we are looking at every part of the child within the context of the family to understand them. One of the things that was really challenging for us as a family, if I put on my mom hat, is uh, I was responsible for fitting a team of providers together to take care of my daughter. And so we had a developmental pediatrician, we had a psychiatrist, we had an advocate for school, we had a therapist, we had an occupational therapist. We had all these different people who were providing care for her or help for her. But I was the quarterback on the team. It was my job to make sure that all the information was exchanged and everyone understood and was talking about, what the other were doing. And I found it exhausting. It was a full time job in addition to the one I already had. So we, looking around, realized that the wait list situation in this country is really, a big challenge for families. And often kids sit on wait lists for care, sometimes, as long as 2 years for developmental pediatricians. So we were committed to providing a new way of thinking about children, a new way of providing care for children, and to make it happen without a wait list or, in a timely way. So when I talk about all the different evaluations that we do, they include academic performance testing or cognitive testing, and that might be full scale IQ or achievement testing. We also look at executive function. Lab tests that includes blood work. So we do baseline blood work looking for all kinds of things: vitamin D levels, exposure to lead, exposure to Lyme disease. I practice in Pennsylvania right now, and Lyme disease up here is, epidemic, and I often it's uncanny how often I find Lyme disease without specific symptoms. So we go looking for all the different things that may be responsible for the root cause of what's going on with the child. We do genetic testing, so we look at the genes that speak to brain chemistry and drug metabolism. So if a child is a candidate for medication, we identify what's the right medication and then also at the right dose for the child. And then we also do a diagnostic psychiatric evaluation and an art therapy evaluation, speech evaluation, OT evaluation. And we take all that information and put it together in one profile to really try to understand what's going on with the child. So, one of the things that we found in our approach, looking at understanding a child versus diagnosing a particular disease, is that we have really clear targets for intervention, and that is especially true in terms of medication. So we have actually done the outcome measurements around this, and we are able to get to the right combination or the right medication with the first trial more than 90% of the time, which is really significant. If you have children who take medicine or have been around kids who take medicine or even adults who take medicine, often that front end of finding the right one is exhausting. You go in, with hope and think, okay, we finally made a decision to try medication. and you take the first one through a trial and error approach. This is kind of standard of care, and it doesn't work. And the next one may not work, or the next one may work, but it has terrible side effects. And so often families feel hopeless at the end of the first round of med trial, and think that no medicine will work. What we've found is that there's a large percentage of the time where it's just not being dosed correctly, or it's not the right class of medicine for the problem. And we get those results with the genetic testing that we use. Those I just want to back up a second. The genetic testing also informs how we think about the child from a brain chemistry perspective. So one of the genes in our panel it highly connects to ADHD. It tells me how a child's brain is using a brain chemistry called dopamine. And dopamine is that brain molecule of excitement and pleasure, and also attention, focus, concentration, and hyperactivity. And so, if there's a change on that gene, it gives me a clue about what might be going on with the child if attention is a problem. So, when we look at the whole child and we find all the targets that rise to the top in terms of intervention, we then ask the question, how does that translate to the life of the child as far as education is concerned? We think about school for children in the way that we think about work for adults. So, you can imagine if you went to work every day and people said mean things to you, or it was really hard for you to understand what was happening around you, or you felt like you were missing pieces of information, you can imagine how stressful that would be in your work life. And often that's the experience of kids. So we take what we learn about a child and translate it into what that child needs to be successful in education. So when we're specifically talking about children who have had trauma in their background, or looking at issues related to attachment, looking at the kind of psychosocial factors that can affect brain development, it's really important that we try to separate and understand each one. So it's possible to have more than one thing going on. And it's important to identify as many as you can so that you're making sure that we're hitting all the targets to help the child be successful. So, trauma is something that we need to think about, ask questions about, and understand. Um, ADHD is often, or the symptoms of ADHD is often a consequence of growing up with trauma. We also need to understand the issues with attachment, really look at what is attachment and reactive attachment disorder. We've had the privilege of helping many families here at the practice who have adopted children, and it's been my experience that the idea of reactive attachment is well discussed, well covered within adoption communities, and it's also sometimes left at that. So a lot of the symptoms that are present with attachment issues cross over and are common symptoms of other things. So attention deficit disorder, anxiety. There's a lot of crossover, and if we just house everything under attachment, we miss vital opportunities to intervene. So the goal is to take every possible touch point, put it together, achieve understanding, teach the grown-ups around the child what's going on, then teach the child about themselves, and then extend that understanding out into the world, whether it's school or extended family. Um, that is that's the way that we believe we create a path for success. So, as I mentioned earlier, when you look at what trauma can do, and early childhood trauma, there are actually brain changes that occur, and so trauma can have an initial and a lasting effect, on children. If you are adopting or considering adopting a child who's experienced trauma, there are certain things that you can predict um, that that child will need help with. And so there are multiple things that you can do to intervene, including counseling. There are medications used to address significant trauma symptoms, and there are therapies that actually work. So there's a particular therapy that we use here with children called trauma narrative therapy, and what you do in trauma narrative therapy is construct the story for the child. So the thing that's most challenging for children, and from a brain based perspective, one of the things that's most challenging is that trauma often happens to children before they have good language acquisition, which means that things are happening to them. They're experiencing things that are really intense and really overwhelming, and they may not even have the words to attach to the experience. The other thing that happens with trauma is I laugh with kids when I talk about this. Time gets weird. And so you may have a child who has experienced, you know, a chronic, like a timeline in their life that is validated by the adults around them, and yet their memory and their experience of that timeline is really different. And it's because those memories are stored without connection. And so trauma narrative therapy really goes to the root of giving the trauma language, so telling the story, and putting the story, the events in context, so establishing that timeline, and then helping the child process whatever feelings they have around it. And one of the beautiful things that I've seen as a result of doing this work with children is the end result of this kind of therapy is the trauma loses its power, and they're actually able to heal, and in very specific ways heal their brain, and move on from the trauma. So in the second case study, it's really about looking at the differentiation between trauma and attachment. So you guys are my heroes because you're really accepting the challenge of parenting and caring for children who are very complex. And so the work on the front end is understanding and differentiating between trauma. Trauma doesn't always lead to reactive attachment disorder. Separating out what are the symptoms of reactive attachment disorder, attachment, and getting appropriate interventions for that. Um, the movement through systems, including foster care and other systems that children experience when they're moving on the path to adoption, that doesn't always equal a mental illness, depression, anxiety, or ADHD. And there are lots of areas for exploration before we settle on what we're going to call this and what we're going to do about it. And so, in a particular situation, and I'm just going to give you some examples. In a particular situation, I met a child who was being adopted, or had been adopted on the path to adoption, and had a history of being diagnosed with many of the things on this slide. So ADHD and trauma and potentially attachment disorder, and those are kind of the expected labels that I see coming out of systems. And what wasn't well understood were all of the other variables that could impact on this child's life and performance. So um, there had been attention paid to the most, I guess, the most distressing symptoms, right? So the child would have meltdowns and, serious behavior and require, pretty significant intervention, or the child was really struggling to learn. And so those behaviors were attended to and called ADHD. What wasn't explored were all of the layers underneath that. And so when you look at ADHD, you have to ask the question, okay, is there also an auditory processing problem? Because those two things look very similar. And the treatment for ADHD is not the same as the treatment for auditory processing disorder. And so being able to evaluate and separate those two things is incredibly helpful. And in this situation, led to a pretty significant auditory evaluation from an audiologist. And lo and behold, one of the findings was that this child actually needed hearing aids. So there was a true hearing loss, hearing issue that was had not been identified previously. That was really the root cause of some of the symptoms that we saw that were being called ADHD or behavioral symptoms. And so that's an example of, if that wasn't identified. I think this, my sense is this child would be um, okay. Things would continue to move on, and certainly none of the other treatments or interventions that were attempted would be as effective because a piece of the root cause was missed. So it's important, as you're thinking about bringing children into your life, that the the you are able to think about and pay attention to all of the layers, or look beyond the superficial. So it's my opinion and belief that as children come into your life and mine as well, a thorough evaluation is important to help understand because of these kinds of issues. So once you've figured out the what's going on, and we think about it here in terms of strengths and weaknesses, and that's why we call it superpowers, looking for superpowers. So there's always in every profile of every child we evaluate, you can clearly point to areas where they're very strong. So all humans are built with cognitive strengths and weaknesses, emotional strengths and weaknesses. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and so we choose to focus here first on the strengths and use those strengths to leverage and support the weaknesses. So once we've figured that out, then we transition that knowledge to school. And so families often are the driver for advocating for children in school and for children's success. And so again, if I haven't said it enough, I'll probably say it 10 more times. You're heroes to me, and the sheroes and heroes, in the sense that you are helping to support and encourage a child and advocate on their behalf for their ultimate success. So this section of the slide deck is really speaking to rights and the issues around education and accommodations. So, one of the busiest times in the life of my practice is back to school. So around here, it usually we're pretty busy at the end of the school year, kind of getting everybody situated for the summer and evaluating how the school year ended, and everybody's so happy and excited and ready to go into summer. And then August hits, and everybody needs an appointment, and it can be a really high stress time. It's a high demand time around here. And part of that is because parents care about their children's experience and success. And so often some of the things that we've talked about, some of the weaknesses that we've talked about are described, cause problems with school. And so I thought it was helpful, or could be helpful to talk about the process of getting or securing accommodations or support for children in school. So everyone has the right to be evaluated. So you, by the simple fact of fostering or adopting a child, have the right to request an evaluation for special education services from the public school. There's a federal law that supports this, and I didn't point it out before, but there are references on each of these slides to websites and links that can give you more information about this. Um, so there's a section of the federal law called the Child Find Law that says if a parent or other identifies a concern as it relates to the child's ability to receive a free and appropriate public education, the school district by law is required to do the evaluation. So, if there is a diagnosis, if there is a concern about learning, if there is a concern about behavior, all of those are reason to request an evaluation from the school. So, the result of that evaluation is information that would inform a plan of accommodation for your child. So there are two different kinds of plans for children within school systems. So an IEP is an individualized education plan. A 504B is a plan for accommodations for a medical diagnosis. So in the IEP, or the individualized education plan, the school has identified a specific learning disability, the diagnosis of autism. School districts have their own categories that qualify for an IEP. And so if your child meets the requirement for any of those categories, then the school by law is required to construct an individualized education plan. That plan is pretty, it should be comprehensive. It should incorporate goals and ways to measure and track performance. And it should also include accommodations. So the accommodations are what the school is going to do to help your child be successful. So the IEP is a contractual document that you request for the evaluation. The school completes the evaluation. Then everyone gets together to go over the results. And if the child meets criteria, then the IEP is created. The IEP is should be signed off by the parent. So, as a parent, you would need to be in agreement with the plan. And there are ways to, there are mechanisms that you can use if you don't agree with the plan. So, you can ask for more information, or you can ask for the team to think about adding something different. You have that right. And the intent is that the plan that is put in place is informed by the school and the parents and the child, and is really personalized so that the child can be successful. That's the highest level of intervention within the school district, an IEP. If your child does not meet any of the categories that the school uses, has an autism diagnosis, has a specific learning disability. There's a category called other health impairment. So that would be if they had a hearing difference, or a speech difference, or so those are the kind of school-based categories. If your child doesn't have any of those, they are still eligible for accommodations if they have a medical diagnosis. And so often we see this 504B plan constructed when a child has serious anxiety, or the child has attention related issues but doesn't have trouble in terms of getting good grades. So maybe their organization, the way they organize things, turning in homework, those are all problems. And at the end of the day, the child is still able to take a test and pass it. That wouldn't rise to the level of an IEP. That would be addressed with a 504B plan. So the only thing that's required to get a 504B accommodation is a medical diagnosis of something. Something being anxiety, depression, ADHD. You can have a 504B plan for someone who has a seizure disorder, for someone who is, has a hypoglycemia or is diabetic. So I don't want everyone to think that this just relates to mental health issues. You can also have a 504B for medical concerns. So, some of the things that you can do immediately if you have heard this information and thought to yourself, wow, I think that might apply here to me in my life and my child, you can request the evaluation. And so, the way that you request the evaluation is through a formal request. You need to write a letter, and that letter is delivered to the child's school, and usually starts with the guidance office. But you can also deliver the letter to principal, or it's really anyone in the administrative side of the school. Excuse me, sorry. Once you have requested the evaluation, the school district has a set amount of time to complete the evaluation. And it never feels like it happens fast enough. Everybody, you've decided I want an evaluation, and you want it right away to understand and be helpful. And so the school district has between 30 and 60 days to turn around from your request of the evaluation to an IEP meeting and to begin the process of developing the plan. I have very rarely met a school district or heard of a school district that was willing to do an evaluation without a request from the family. So it's really important to keep in mind the rules of that formal request. Ways that you can put a 504B plan into action is to ask your pediatrician or the behavior specialist, whoever might be working, psychologist, whoever might be working with your child, for a specific diagnosis letter, and then to document whatever they might need for accommodation. And then it's really important to attend the meeting.
Amy, do you want me to jump in on the next two so you can grab some water?
Thank you very much. I thought it was going to stop, and it's just not. So thank you. Yeah.
No worries. One of the things that I learned going through the IEP process on the parent side, there are plenty of meetings, and it requires some diligent note taking, and receiving copies of things that are big long forms. We created a binder here at the house, slipped them into sleeves. It was pretty easy, but it's important to keep that archive. I also found when I went in person, I got a lot more information than when I attended by phone. Interestingly enough, for those of you who are in hourly positions, there is a current court case being reviewed because I believe it's in the state of North Carolina. The extensive time away from work to attend these meetings is not explicitly called out as a protected activity in support of a family member with a medical condition under FMLA or something like that. And there's a court case right now attempting to make that possible. As we see updates, we'll make sure that they're available to you as families. Going forward, I stuck this example in for you guys. Amy's Practice has a really amazing tool. It's like 8 pages long of all of the different types of accommodations schools are able to provide. In practice, they will offer to do the shortest list of things, but CICS has this really great tool. We'll make sure to make it available to all of the participants on this broadcast, and to the broader Family Match Adoption Share community. And then I love this example. I feel like, you know, the word anxiety is kind of tossed around. But this is just a really great example of, I think I counted earlier, it was 26 different accommodations that can be made possible for students with anxiety. One of the cool things that I learned in my own experience going through this, the actual anxiety category in my school district here in Virginia shifted, and it restricted the number of classes my daughter would have been able to be eligible to take. So the district was actually able to create a path to make some of the accommodations she needed available without using the anxiety qualifier. So really think about going into the IEP 504 space as a constructive, creative opportunity to explore what your child needs. They don't need all of these things in some cases, but it's just great to know that some of these more creative opportunities are available. My daughter has spoken about this publicly, but she was down the street at a different school, thank goodness, from the Parkland school shooting when she first then transitioned and then, went to school here. It was extremely nerve wracking to be in a busy school with so many students and be going through adoption and so we were able to create support structures for her inside of the school environment. Um, Thanks to the tips in this website or web sheet from Amy's practice, to just soften the experience, create, for example, when the drills were happening at school, she was one of three students actually that they kind of tapped quietly a couple minutes before, got them into a room where they kind of less heard the alarms and sirens, and just created just a more safe experience. And I'm thrilled to say it took less than 3 months, and she completely changed her own personal response and reaction because she could feel the embrace and support from everybody around her. And so that's the path that we all hope to see, right? So her anxiety softened. The school's embrace was a huge marker of safety and security for her, and we all moved on. Amy, I am now just in that last little section. I want to make sure we have a couple minutes before one for the Q&A. But you pulled together some awesome tools for everybody that they could start doing, this week with their kiddos to kind of help reinforce the positive side without sort of going into a dark place for back to school. So I'll turn it back to you if you've had water. Otherwise, I'm happy to keep going.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, no worries.
Um, I don't know what that was. Yeah, so thank you for covering your. That was amazing. You identified some really key things that are important to think about in supporting a child. It's individualized. Not all childs experience the same things or have the same kind of trauma or trauma response. So that's really important to let the child be part of that meeting and making that plan. I also looked at the time while I was coughing and realized that I'm going to move pretty quickly through the last of these slides so that we have time for a Q&A. But I do think it's important to point out that all children have some sort of transition related change when we move from summer to back to school. So it's common for kids in the first 2 or 3 weeks back to school, all children, to be tired, to have less resilience, to be moody or crabby. Everybody's kind of going through this schedule change and routine change, and so that's to be expected. If it lasts longer than the first couple of weeks, it's really important to pay attention and start to ask questions about what may be going on. So some of the behaviors that you may see are on slide 19, and they're not really significantly explosive or overt behaviors that people recognize as the surface of a bigger problem. So changes in habits, loss of appetite, a lot of increased worrying, withdrawing from social interactions, and even physical complaints. My stomach hurts. I have a headache. I need to go to the nurse. I often recommend if your child has a couple of visits to the nurse that you just keep track of for a while what's going on, how many visits, because that can be a sign of anxiety in children. Okay, so there are other options in terms of addressing the sensory side of of anxiety or stress for your child. And slide 21 is just looking at ways that you can work with a child in helping them achieve emotional and physical regulation. And so pay attention to the noise in your house, pay attention to the lighting, the commotion, the ebb and flow of activities, and try to understand how that impacts your child. Um, the engage your whole body is important in thinking about overall health and how our brain is affected by level of activity, doing things together, community, and also things that you enjoy or they enjoy. So that's important to remember in terms of kind of overall health and brain health. And then looking for opportunities to improve relationships. And for you guys, that's really really important. And finding opportunities to spend time together that allow both yourself and the child the opportunity to be vulnerable, to share experiences, to be part, to create family together is really important. And then there are some tools. I want to point out my favorite website of all time, understood.org, and it's referenced at the bottom of this slide. So, focusing on the positive, so helping your child build this is an accomplishment box, and it's a way of recognizing both for yourself and your child all of the things that your child is doing well and building on that. There are also things like lunch notes. So feeling connected doesn't have to be always in person, and this is a great way for your child to be connected to you while they're at school. So lunchbox notes. I think I mentioned my children are much older, so I haven't used lunchbox notes in a while. Whitney was sharing with me earlier that they're readily available at Target and Walmart, and it's a great way of building a sense of connection when you're apart during the day. Everything from jokes to um, affirmations. I think you're awesome because these are the ways that you can build that. And that's it. So we're at questions, and I think we have about 10 minutes, 8 minutes to take questions.